So what is our role in finding out what the truth is?
Well, I would argue that we really confront chaos media today. The media in the West is entirely in the hands of billionaires who have agendas and are determined that these agendas will be successful. And that ranges from the war in Ukraine to what's happening in the Middle East to, alleged Chinese aggression and our war with China and all this sort of business. That's simply a fact of life. Now, there's some good news here, and that's called the alternative media. There are lots of people out there in the alternative media who are trying to do exactly what you just described, identify the truth and get it to the population that's willing to listen to it. I think we have an aging group of boomers who are probably beyond reaching when it comes to the truth. They are comfortable with what they're being told because it reflects no change in their universe. But once you get below the boomer level, you start talking to people in their early 50s, 40s, 30s, 20s. It's a different ball game. And I think most people in those categories are not happy with the mainstream media and what it produces. And so people like you and many others have an opportunity to fill in the blanks that are left by the mainstream media. I think what we need, and this is something that I've been trying to work on, is something referred to as authority media.
Mm-hmm.
Back in the mid 60s, when I was growing up, I remember vividly these people called Huntley Brinkley and Walter Conkright and so forth. And I remember that once it became abundantly clear that everything the administration had been telling people about Vietnam was false, and that was really a consequence of the Tet Offensive.
Right.
Completely undermined the mountain of lies that had been given us. Walter Conkright came on and said, it's effectively time to leave. This war is a failure. It doesn't make any sense. There are no attainable objectives. It's time for the United States to chart a way out of it. Well, when he said that, Lyndon Johnson said, oh my God, we've lost the war. We've lost Walter Conkright.
I've lost middle America if I've lost Walter Cronkite. Yes.
So, here we are. Where's Walter Cronkite? Well, he's not even in cold storage. He's dead and buried. There's nothing like it today. So when you turn on Fox and Friends, or you turn on MSNBC or CNN, it doesn't matter. It's all the same. And you're getting different versions of it. And a lot of it has just become, as you know, Lionel, entertainment.
And we're also talking about Vladimir Putin using this Russophobic Boris Badenov and Natasha lunacy. And we're this close to perhaps a nuclear confrontation. Is that even possible?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's possible. Oh. I think things have changed profoundly. Let me go back to my experience when I arrived at West Point, and as I was going through it. I would say the vast majority of our instructors had at least one, usually two tours of duty in Vietnam. Many of them were decorated combat veterans, decorated for valor. They were intelligent people. They'd all been to graduate school. They were overwhelmingly graduates. They had a deep interest in West Point and what happened there. And of course, at that time, remember, we were all men. That makes a huge difference to the chemistry in your classrooms and what happens on the playing fields and everything you do. Men are much harder on men than they are on men and women. And these men were very honest with us. And several of us, several times, I remember more than one time when the instructor would say, all right, that's it for what we're discussing today, whether it was mathematics, chemistry, engineering, physics, whatever. We had an awful lot of math and science in my day, which interested me very little, but I survived it. And they would stop and they would say, well, let's talk about X. And people would raise their hands and say, sir, you were in Vietnam. We don't really know what's happening over there. None of us have been there. Can you tell us something about it? And I would tell you, Lionel, that they were very honest. And the vast majority of them said, I don't know what the hell we were doing over there. It didn't make any sense. And they said, you're put in a situation as a professional soldier where you're told to go there. You go there, they send you into the field, you encounter somebody that shoots at you, and so you try to kill them. And this goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on, and you see people on your side killed, you see large numbers of the opponents killed, And then you ask, what's the point? Where are we headed? You know, my view is that ending up in Vietnam is like ending up at Stalingrad.
Right.
You know, the Germans looked around. I talked to many German veterans, and they would tell me, you know, once you went east of Kiev, there was nothing there. There's nothing out there. Vast open spaces, steppes, dense forests, some Russians, and then increasingly Tartars and Mongols and Turks. But there was nothing there. What are we doing here? You know, what are we trying to conquer?
There's no there, I think, as Dorothy Parker said.
And I think that's been the problem in the United States now for a long time. We do not develop any sort of serious strategy that addresses our real interests. And part of that is the fact that we are planet America. We may be on the planet, but we are our own planet. And most Americans, as you know, Lionel, on any given day, if you live in Kansas City or you live, on Puget Sound, or you're somewheres in the vicinity of Eastern Oregon on the border with Idaho, what are you worried about? Are you worried about the Middle East? Are you worried about Europe or anything else? No, you have a life where you are. You're worried about sustaining your life, preserving your family, whatever, earning enough income to provide for a standard of living, send your children to school. We can go on and on. So places like Ukraine or southern Lebanon or anywhere beyond the borders of the United States are sort of novel, but not very interesting. They're just, nobody's paying much attention. This is a killer for us. I concluded very early on. In fact, I heard one of my professors at West Point say this, who was an experienced soldier. He said, I've decided that if the average American can't point to the place on a map and pronounce the name properly, we probably shouldn't go.
I can't believe you said this. I carry this in my briefcase. I got this at the dollar store. And I said, here, point to Ukraine, roughly. just roughly. Give me an idea. Is either this side or this side. Point to it. I one time saw somebody who had outside their office the Ukrainian flag upside down.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, history would be a wonderful thing if only it were true. What Tolstoy said, I heard one time, I read a statistic, I don't even know if it's true, that in 1921, and I might be getting it wrong, and they varied, 80% of all Soviet men died in World War II. Everybody born in, I think it was 1921. Now, the loss of Russia in World War II, they were our ally. And aside from this Saving Private Ryan version of World War II, and Normandy was critical, there's no doubt about that, but do we forget who these people were? They were our allies. They could have beaten Hitler.
Well, Lionel, I would tell you that the Soviets were never our allies, ever. And that's why when FDR sent...
They were never what, sir? I'm sorry. They were
never
what?
our allies. Never. Stalin and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union that he led were interested in aggrandizing the Soviet Union. In other words, expanding it, increasing the numbers of nations that were brought under its rule. But they were not our allies. They fought for things that had nothing to do with what we were fighting for. So I think we need to keep that in mind. Now, as far as casualties are concerned, when I was in Moscow in 2001, I was still on active duty. It was an official delegation that visited the Russian General Staff College, which was called at the time before this time the Voroshilov. And the historians gave us a briefing, and the historian that talked about the Second World War to us very briefly said, well, the NKVD archives, which at that point were still open to the public, indicate that we've lost 39,900,000 and we are still counting. Now, as this information came out, you can imagine the Russian populace was horrified. They'd been told 20 million.
Mm-hmm.
It was bad, but now you're talking twice that number. So Putin, who was in a very desperate situation, trying to recover some measure of patriotism and love of country and everything else, shut down the NKVD archives. He had to. I mean, really, he was afraid there were going to be uprisings in the streets and so forth. Stalin executed 1 million Soviet soldiers who refused to fight against the Wehrmacht. There were millions of people who sided all over Eastern Europe with the Wehrmacht, not because they were fanatical Nazis, it had nothing to do with it. It's because Nazism, however much we may not like it, was infinitely preferable to communism. We've never come to terms with that reality. Now, I don't think Vladimir Putin is going to stand up and tell us that, But he knows the truth, and he knows what went on. And the good news for us, which is what I stress more than anything else, is while I wouldn't have lifted a finger in 1941 or 42, 43, 44 to help Stalin and that slave state that he ruled over, or the slave armies that he employed, I am absolutely opposed to taking up arms under any circumstances against the Russia today, because Russia today is totally divorced from that.